Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well. My name is Juan and welcome back to another book review. So today we're going to talk about the classic novel Frankenstein by the English writer Mary Shelley. Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, that's the full title, was first published in 1818, so over 200 years ago, and it is considered by some the first science fiction novel ever written. By the way, if you appreciate my reviews and would like to show your support, please give this review a like and subscribe to my channel. Those simple acts will help my videos get to more people who will also appreciate them. So thank you for doing that. Let's now talk about Frankenstein. So, I have read Frankenstein a few times, and I've always struggled a little bit with the writing style. I've always had the feeling that the novel is a little bit all over the place and not that very well written. But, what is well or badly written, if not highly subjective concepts, right? So despite this impression, I have also always thought that Frankenstein was an important book and rightly considered a classic because I think it continues to speak to us, and I don't think what it has to tell us will ever get old. Now, most people know about the scientist who creates a monster with body parts he collects from cadavers. And while that does happen in the novel, I think most people get their ideas on Frankenstein from movie adaptations and not from the novel itself. Now, if you have been watching my reviews for a while, you'll know that I pitch them to both people who haven't read the books I review and those who have. And this review of Frankenstein is not going to be different in that respect. It is, however, hard, I think, to talk about a book like this because even people who haven't read it think they already know what it is about. But really, there is a lot more to Frankenstein than the story of a crazy scientist who makes a monster. And finding that out, I think, was one of the best things about reading this novel the first time. Now, not everything in Frankenstein is universal. Not everything in the novel will speak to us. Some of the ideas in the novel are of their time. So let me start by talking about those and the context of when the novel was written, right? So Mary Shelley was 19 when she wrote Frankenstein, but it is not that surprising that a 19-year-old would write such a novel when we know who her parents were. So Mary Shelley was born Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. She was the daughter of two important intellectuals. Her mother was the philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft, famous, of course, for her proto-feminist book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which is one of the most important books on the rights of women written before the advent of feminism. And her father was the writer and philosopher William Godwin, who is famous in his own right for having written a novel called Caleb Williams, among other books. Now, with those politically radical parents, it is hardly surprising that Mary Shelley associated herself with other radical thinkers of her generation. She wrote Frankenstein while on a European vacation in Geneva with her then lover and future husband, the poet Percy Shelley, and their friend, the also poet Lord Byron. Now, the genesis of the novel was a competition between the three friends to see who would write the best horror story. So, while some people consider Frankenstein to be the first science fiction novel, its status as a Gothic novel is undisputable. The Gothic novel, by the way, was a hugely popular genre in the early 19th century, but some of its tropes, I think, have become cliches to us over time. But what makes Frankenstein a novel of its time is its interest in highlighting the sublime aspect of nature. This is a very romantic, with a capital R, concept. Now, Romanticism was a literary movement that originated in Europe in the late 18th century, but had its peak in the first half of the 19th century. The Romantics reacted to the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and all the social changes ushered in by them. So in a nutshell, the Romantics turned their attention back to the individual and emphasized emotion over reason. Now, Mary Shelley, Percy Shelley, and Lord Byron were Romantics. The Romantics loved sublime nature, which explains why English Romantics were so fascinated by places like Switzerland or Germany, because being English, they had to cross the channel to be in the presence of sublime nature. You know, I used to live in England, and it is a very hilly country, not very impressive naturally. There are not many mountains in England, and the few there exist are not very tall or impressive. Definitely not what you would call sublime. Now, in the case of Frankenstein, there is a lot of ice and cold, high winds, storms, extreme weather. Then in the novel hit big lakes, treacherous mountains, or glaciers. But what makes Frankenstein a timeless classic is how it deals with monstrosity and the dangers of knowledge. At the center of the novel, we have a monster. But what makes this unnamed creature a monster? On the one hand, its appearance, right? The creature is too tall. I think its height is mentioned in the novel to be 8 feet, and he looks ugly by anyone's standard. So most people who come across a creature are terrified and disgusted by its appearance. But more fundamentally, the creature is a monster because of how he was created. He was not conceived by a woman in the only possible way available in the 19th century. You know, at some point in the 20th century, it became possible for children to be conceived through science. But issues like human cloning or stem cell research still cause heated discussions about ethics, right? Also, when it comes to identity and bodies, the relationship between identities and bodies, trans issues have entered mainstream discussion in recent years. I don't think that reading Frankenstein honestly would shed any light on biopolitics or issues about bodies and identity, but it is interesting to see that broadly all of this was already a source of anxiety 200 years ago. And what about the limits of scientific knowledge and its ethical implications? As a romantic, Mary Shelley would have been against the kind of scientific knowledge that seeks to emulate God, and probably would have preferred it if science stayed within very clearly demarcated limits. But how about you? What do you think? Should scientists be free to do what they want, or should there be limits to scientific knowledge? These are some of the, I think, most interesting questions that Frankenstein raises, but now I would like to go deeper into the novel. But I can only do that if I talk about the plot in a lot more detail. So if you haven't read Frankenstein yet or don't want to hear any spoilers from me, you should probably stop watching this video right about now, because between now and the end of the video, I am going to talk about the plot of Frankenstein, its characters, and some of its themes in a lot more detail. And there will be some spoilers. So if you don't want any spoilers, you have been warned. You should stop watching now, and I'll see you again soon, I hope, for another book review. Okay, for those of you who are still here, I am going to summarize the plot of Frankenstein now. Okay, so the novel begins with an epistolary structure. So we read a series of letters written by Robert Walton, the captain of a ship. Robert Walton is on an expedition to the North Pole, and he writes to his sister back in England to tell her how his mission is going. At first, we learn that the mission is successful, but then the ship encounters so much ice that it gets trapped. That setback is what allows Walton to meet Victor Frankenstein. So Victor Frankenstein has been sledding on the ice and is exhausted, so Walton invites him to come aboard the ship. As Walton nurses Frankenstein back to health, he hears a scientist's fantastic story. So Frankenstein, the novel, is a framed narrative with a Russian doll structure. So we have Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein, telling his story to Robert Walton, who then writes letters to his sister about it. Anyway, the story begins in Geneva. Where else? You know, remember that Mary Shelley began writing the novel in that Swiss town, right? Anyway, Victor tells the captain about his childhood in Geneva, which apparently was very happy. Victor talks about Elizabeth Lavenza, who is his cousin in the first edition from 1818, or his adopted sister in the 1831 edition. I think most people now read the 1818 edition, but just in case, that's a small difference between the two texts. Now, apart from Elizabeth, Victor has a friend called Henry Clerval. Victor then goes to college in Ingolstadt. At university, he becomes obsessed with discovering the secret of life and begins his research to find it. When Victor thinks that he has worked out the secret of life, he begins to work on actually creating life. For months, he goes around hunting down body parts from dead people, and then he puts all those body parts together to assemble a creature. Finally, the night arrives when his creation will come alive. However, once he's created life, he is horrified by his own creature. Later, he tries to go to sleep, but keeps having nightmares about the monster he created. So he gets up, runs out, and when he's wandering the streets, he bumps into his friend Henry, who is now also, studying at the same university. The two men go back to Victor's place, only to find that the monster has gone. Victor falls ill. He decides to go back to Geneva, where he thinks he will recover, but just before he goes, he gets a letter from his father telling him that his younger brother William has been killed by strangulation. Victor rushes to Geneva naturally, and on his way back there, he goes through the forest where his brother was murdered. Victor sees the monster at the forest and assumes that his brother's murderer is the monster. However, the person accused of the murder is Justine Moritz, who is a sweet girl that had been adopted by the Frankensteins. She tries to defend herself in vain because she's sentenced to death and executed. Victor feels guilty because he's convinced that the monster he created has killed two innocent people who were dear to him, right? His brother William directly and Justine indirectly. Now, Victor thinks that a vacation will help him feel better, so he goes to the mountains. One day, as he's going across a glacier, he meets the monster again. The monster confesses his guilt to the murder of William. He explains that he was lonely and that after being shunned by everyone, he wanted to get back at Victor for having created him. And that is why he killed William. The monster then asks Victor to create a companion for him, because he thinks that only another monster could accept to be his mate. And he's probably right about that. The last thing Victor wants is to create another monster, but eventually he lets himself be convinced. The monster is so eloquent here, and I think that would come as a surprise to people whose only references are the movie adaptations, because in those movies, the monster usually can barely string a sentence together and usually just grunts and moans, but that is not at all from the novel. Now that Victor has agreed to create a female monster, he goes back to Geneva and then goes to England with Henry on a research trip for this unusual project. Then both men go up to Scotland. Henry stays on the mainland while Victor goes to the Orkneys to work on his second creature. On another terrifying moment in the novel, one night Victor looks out of the window only to see the monster looking back at him. Victor is so conflicted about all this that he decides to destroy the female creature he had been working on. The monster sees that and gets so angry at Victor that he says he will take revenge on him. The monster swears that he will be there on Victor's wedding night. That very night, Victor goes to a lake and throws the remains of the female creation overboard. He's then unable to go back to the island, however, because of strong winds. The following morning, he reaches the shore finally, but he's near a town unfamiliar to him. He's arrested for a murder that took place the night before. Victor rightly claims he's innocent, but he's in shock when he finds out that the victim is none other than his friend Henry. He knows right away, and we all know right away when we read the novel, that the killer is the monster. Now in prison, Victor falls ill once again, but then he recovers and is acquitted. He naturally goes back to Geneva. Victor marries Elizabeth, but because of the monster's previous threat, he thinks the monster will come to kill him on his wedding night. So what he does is that he sends Elizabeth away and stays waiting for the monster to show up so he can face him. Stupidly, in my view, Victor doesn't realize that what the monster meant was that he would kill his bride on his wedding night and not him. And lo and behold, that is exactly what happens. The monster kills Elizabeth. A short time later, Victor's father dies, but this time from natural causes. The monster is not at all involved. Now alone, Victor pledges to hunt the monster down. Victor goes north in search of the monster. He chases the monster on a frozen sea, but when he's just about to get to him, the ice breaks, and that creates a gap between them. And that's what had just happened when Walton encountered Victor. But don't worry, that is not the end of the novel. The rest of the story is told by Walton again in a series of letters to his sister. So we learn that Victor, who was extremely ill at that point, dies. And days after his death, Walton finds the monster crying in the room where Victor's body is kept. The monster tells Walton that he's lonely and full of remorse. The monster also says that he wants to put an end to his suffering and heads further north to die alone in the ice. And that is the end of the novel. As you can see, it has truly little to do with the 1931 classic horror movie directed by James Whale or its sequel, Bride of Frankenstein from 1935. I think Frankenstein, the novel, has the capacity to surprising readers because it's probably not what most would expect, and I think it would actually be better than what most people expect. One of the most surprising things is how intelligent and sensitive the monster is, which is not how he's usually portrayed in those movies. Well, you know, some of the movies do portray him as somehow sensitive, but never intelligent or articulate. But the monster Mary Shelley envisions is extremely articulate and even persuasive. I also think that the social alienation that the monster feels will speak to many readers. The monster becomes a criminal, a murderer, because he's socially alienated. And I think this idea broadly aligns with progressive thinking, and it's interesting that that is the way people like Mary Shelley saw it 200 years ago. And, you know, perhaps this is a simplistic question, but who do you think the biggest villain in the novel is, Victor Frankenstein or the monster? The fact that this novel continues to be so thought-provoking, I think makes it well worth reading. But now, you know, really what I would like would be to hear from you and to hear what you think about Frankenstein. So please let me know in the comment section down below. Signing off now, so thank you for watching. I hope to see you again very soon for another video. Bye for now.